Labor Day weekend, 1994, Indianapolis, Indiana. The temperature at Indianapolis Raceway Park that afternoon sat in the mid-80s, the air thick with humidity, and the smell of race fuel drifting across the biggest event on the entire NHRA calendar. And somewhere in the staging lanes at the U.S. Nationals, the defending Pro Stock points leader, a Dodge driver out of Michigan named Darrell Alderman, rolled to the line in a car that was about to produce a sound nobody in the pits that day would ever fully forget. His name was already legendary in Pro Stock circles. 2 world championships already banked, a third on the way, a partnership with a small independent shop called Wayne County Speed Shop that had somehow turned a Dodge Daytona into the most dominant naturally aspirated race car of its era. But on that specific run at Indianapolis, Alderman's Dodge produced a violent carburetor backfire, a sound so unusual, so mechanically wrong for a naturally aspirated engine, that it stopped conversations across the entire pit area. Crew chiefs from rival teams turned their heads, reporters started asking questions, and a rumor that had been quietly circulating through the Pro Stock garage for months suddenly had a very specific, very public moment attached to it: nitrous oxide. The specific 2 words that, once spoken openly in the pit area that afternoon, would follow Darrell Alderman for the rest of his career and long after it ended, regardless of what any technical inspection ever did or did not find. NHRA officials pulled Alderman's engine apart with the kind of scrutiny normally reserved for a car caught in the act. Pro Stock rules banned power adders outright. No superchargers, no turbochargers, and absolutely no nitrous oxide injection of any kind. Every engine in the class was required to be naturally aspirated, breathing only through a carburetor, competing purely on cubic inches, compression, and engineering refinement. If Alderman's Dodge was using nitrous, it would represent one of the most significant cheating scandals in the history of professional drag racing. NHRA's technical inspectors tore the engine down completely. They found a factory-legal Chrysler small block, within displacement limits, running a carburetor within the class's specifications. They found no nitrous bottle, no injection solenoid, no telltale plumbing anywhere in the car. Nothing that violated a single word of the rulebook. And that is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because the backfire happened. Multiple witnesses heard it. The sound itself was, according to engine builders across the sport who reviewed it afterward, extraordinarily difficult to explain from a purely naturally aspirated combination. But NHRA's own technical staff, using every inspection method available to them at the time, could not find a single piece of hardware to point to. Nothing illegal, nothing that could be disqualified. Just an engine that behaved, on that one specific run, like something running far more aggressive than the rulebook allowed, and a technical inspection process that came back clean every single time it looked. Here is the part that should disturb you even more. What if the reason NHRA's inspectors kept coming back clean was not because nothing unusual was happening inside that Dodge, but because whatever was happening had been engineered, from the very beginning, to be functionally invisible to the specific inspection methods available to a sanctioning body in the early 1990s? Not a single hidden trick. 5 separate engineering decisions, each individually defensible, each individually explainable, that combined into a power delivery profile the rest of the Pro Stock field simply could not match using conventional naturally aspirated engineering. Stay with me, because in the next 30 minutes I am going to walk you through the 5 specific areas of Darrell Alderman's Dodge Daytona and Avenger combinations, built by the Wayne County Speed Shop, that period competitors, engine builders, and journalists have spent 3 decades theorizing about, piecing together, and in some cases directly alleging, as the explanation behind a level of naturally aspirated performance that NHRA's own technical department was never able to definitively disprove or confirm. I am going to show you the mechanical reasoning behind each theory. Not tabloid speculation repeated at swap meets without context. The actual combustion chemistry, the actual fuel system engineering, the actual inspection loopholes that a naturally aspirated Pro Stock rulebook, written for a different era of technology, may have left wide open for a team willing to explore every inch of what it did not explicitly prohibit. And I am going to make you a promise right now. You will understand exactly why a team that was never once formally disqualified for a nitrous violation still could not shake 3 decades of suspicion from the rest of the sport, suspicion that only deepened when the Wayne County Speed Shop itself was broken into and partially destroyed under circumstances that, to this day, nobody in the sport has ever fully explained. And the most uncomfortable part of that promise, NHRA's own technical department has never been able to prove definitively either way what was actually happening inside that engine. Let's go back to where this story actually starts, in the fuel itself. The fuel blend chemistry that lived at the edge of naturally aspirated logic. NHRA Pro Stock fuel regulations in the early 1990s permitted a specific, tightly defined category of racing gasoline, blended for high-octane, naturally aspirated performance, with a legal framework built around one core assumption: a naturally aspirated engine, breathing only atmospheric pressure through a carburetor, can only extract so much combustion energy from a gallon of legal racing fuel before detonation becomes unavoidable. This assumption governed how every engine builder in the class approached compression ratio, ignition timing, and carburetor tuning. You built your combination around the practical ceiling that legal, naturally aspirated racing fuel imposed, and you accepted that ceiling as a fixed boundary shared equally by every competitor in the field. Wayne County Speed Shop's engine program, developed alongside Alderman and refined over multiple seasons, approached fuel chemistry with a level of granular precision that period competitors openly admitted they could not match. Racing fuel blended within legal specifications still allows meaningful variation in the precise balance of hydrocarbon compounds, octane-boosting additives within legal limits, and oxygenate content, all while technically satisfying the same broad legal category. Most teams purchased fuel from established suppliers and used it largely as delivered. Wayne County's program worked directly with fuel chemists to calibrate blends that sat at the absolute favorable edge of what legal racing gasoline specifications allowed, extracting meaningfully more usable combustion energy from a legal fuel than the sport's broad assumptions accounted for. This is not, by itself, nitrous oxide. It is closer to the fuel percentage edge calibration strategy that has appeared repeatedly throughout drag racing history, a legal fuel formulated to sit as close as possible to the actual physical limits of its legal category rather than comfortably within the middle of it. But combined with the other elements of the Wayne County combination, this fuel chemistry created a foundation of usable combustion energy that made everything else about the engine's performance more plausible without ever requiring a single illegal component. Competing engine builders who later reverse-engineered fragments of the Wayne County fuel program through fuel samples obtained at various events over the years consistently reported blends that pushed further toward the legal edge of the specification than what the rest of the paddock was running, without ever definitively crossing into illegal territory that NHRA's own fuel testing could isolate and disqualify. It was, like so much of this story, a modification hiding inside a category everyone assumed was already standardized. The fuel chemistry alone does not explain a carburetor backfire loud enough to turn heads across an entire pit area at the U.S. Nationals. For that, you have to look at what the Wayne County program was doing with ignition timing and combustion chamber design. The ignition timing curve that behaved differently under load than at idle. Every naturally aspirated Pro Stock engine of this era used a distributor-based or early electronic ignition system calibrated to a specific timing curve, the precise relationship between crankshaft position and spark delivery across the engine's entire RPM range. Conventional engineering wisdom held that this timing curve, once dialed in for a given combination of compression ratio, fuel, and camshaft, should remain essentially consistent across a run, adjusted only for atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity that every team monitored and compensated for using broadly similar methods. The theory that circulated through the Pro Stock garage regarding Wayne County's program centered on ignition timing calibration that behaved in a genuinely unconventional way, shifting more dynamically in relation to load and RPM than most competing systems of the period were configured to do, extracting more usable power from the engine's mid-range without crossing into the detonation territory that aggressive timing normally produces in a naturally aspirated combination. Rival crew chiefs, listening closely to Alderman's engine note across a full run, described a sound that built and behaved differently than their own engines under equivalent load, a subtle but real difference that some attributed simply to superior tuning, and others suspected pointed towards something the sanctioning body's inspection process was not equipped to fully evaluate. Here is the mechanical logic behind why this theory persisted for so long. A naturally aspirated engine extracting genuinely exceptional performance from a legal combination requires an ignition and combustion strategy calibrated with a level of precision most teams simply did not have the engineering resources to develop. Wayne County's relationship with Mopar's factory engineering support gave the program access to combustion chamber analysis and ignition mapping tools that a privateer team could not replicate. Whether that access explains the entire performance gap, or whether it explains only part of it while something more aggressive filled the remaining gap, is precisely the question that NHRA's own technical inspectors were never able to conclusively answer. Because ignition timing curves, unlike a physical nitrous bottle, leave no hardware behind for a post-run teardown to discover. This is the first piece of the puzzle that begins explaining why technical inspection kept coming back clean. You cannot disqualify a team for an ignition timing strategy that is, on its face, completely legal, even if that strategy happens to extract performance that looks, from the outside, difficult to explain through conventional naturally aspirated logic alone. We come now to the third area of scrutiny, and this is the one most directly connected to the specific incident at Indianapolis that made headlines across the sport: the intake manifold and carburetor spacer. Geometry that shaped the backfire itself. A carburetor backfire, mechanically speaking, occurs when combustion or a pressure event happens somewhere in the intake tract outside the combustion chamber itself, typically because of an improperly timed valve event, a lean fuel condition, or an ignition event that fires while intake valves are open long enough for flame to travel backward into the intake manifold and carburetor. In a conventional naturally aspirated engine, this is almost always treated as a symptom of something going wrong, a tuning mistake, a backfire that costs the team time and potentially damages the engine. The theory that persisted regarding Alderman's specific backfire at the 1994 U.S. Nationals centered on intake manifold and carburetor spacer geometry, engineered specifically to shape airflow and fuel distribution in a way that extracted additional performance from the engine's upper RPM range, at the cost of occasionally producing exactly the kind of dramatic backfire event witnessed that weekend. Rival engine builders who examined photographs and second-hand accounts of the incident pointed to the specific character of the sound, describing it as more consistent with an unusually aggressive, naturally aspirated tune operating right at the ragged edge of its own stability, rather than a nitrous-specific detonation event, which typically produces a different, more violent failure signature entirely. This distinction matters enormously to understanding why the incident, dramatic as it was, never actually became the smoking gun that some competitors hoped it would be. NHRA's technical inspectors examining the engine immediately afterward were looking specifically for nitrous-related hardware because that was the allegation circulating through the pits. What they found instead was consistent with a naturally aspirated combination running at an extremely aggressive tuning edge, the kind of edge that occasionally produces a spectacular backfire precisely because it is being pushed as close to the limit of what naturally aspirated combustion can stably produce as engineering skill allows. Whether that aggressive edge was achieved purely through conventional means, exceptional fuel chemistry, unconventional ignition mapping, and precision manifold design, or whether it was assisted by something else entirely that simply was not present in the car during that specific post-run inspection, is a question the sport itself has never been able to definitively answer 3 decades later. The fourth area of scrutiny takes us away from the engine itself and towards something almost nobody outside the immediate Wayne County program fully understood at the time: the solenoid and plumbing architecture. That could be installed and removed within minutes. This is the theory that generated the most serious, most persistent suspicion within the Pro Stock garage, and it centers on a structural reality of how nitrous oxide injection systems are actually built, rather than any specific piece of evidence NHRA ever recovered. A nitrous oxide system, at its core, requires only a handful of components: a pressurized bottle, a solenoid valve to control flow, a small amount of plumbing connecting the solenoid to a delivery point in the intake tract, and an activation trigger tied to the driver's controls. None of these components are large. None of them require permanent, irreversible modification to the engine block or cylinder heads. A sufficiently skilled crew, working with a car they know intimately, could theoretically install a complete nitrous system, run it for a single qualifying pass or elimination round, and remove every trace of it, bottle, solenoid, and plumbing, within the time window between a run and NHRA's post-run technical inspection process, particularly for inspections that were not part of the random or podium-mandated tear-down protocol. This is the theory that made competing crew chiefs across the Pro Stock paddock genuinely uneasy for years, not because anyone could prove it happened, but because the mechanical feasibility of it was undeniable to anyone who understood how simple a nitrous system's physical footprint actually is. NHRA's mandatory tear-down inspections, applied to event winners, runners-up, and randomly selected additional competitors, were thorough, but they inspected the car as it existed at the moment of inspection, not necessarily the car as it existed during the specific run that had raised suspicion in the first place. Wayne County Speed Shop was, according to every account from the era, never once caught with nitrous hardware during a mandated tear-down across Alderman's entire championship-winning career. That fact alone was cited by defenders of the team as definitive proof that the suspicion was simply jealousy from competitors being consistently outperformed. Skeptics countered that the absence of evidence during scheduled inspections was exactly what a program disciplined enough to install and remove a simple nitrous system within a narrow time window would produce, by design. Both interpretations remain entirely consistent with the same set of facts, which is precisely why this question was never resolved through NHRA's own technical process. There is a further wrinkle to this theory that period competitors raised repeatedly, and it concerns the specific architecture of where a hidden system would need to physically live inside a Pro Stock chassis to remain undetected during a routine inspection, while still being genuinely accessible for quick removal. Pro Stock cars of this era, unlike the purpose-built dragsters and funny cars competing in fuel classes, retained substantially more of a production-based body structure, with door panels, trunk areas, and underbody sections that offered considerably more concealment opportunity than the exposed, minimal chassis of a top fuel car. A compact nitrous bottle, mounted in a location that mimicked the appearance of a legal fire suppression system or ballast weight, connected through plumbing routed alongside existing legitimate fuel or vacuum lines, represented exactly the kind of concealment that a visual, non-destructive tear-down inspection was simply not designed to reliably distinguish from the car's legal hardware without disassembling far more of the vehicle than NHRA's standard post-run protocol called for at the time. This is not an allegation that Wayne County specifically did this. It is an explanation of why so many rival engine builders, several of whom later spoke to the theory more openly once Alderman's career had ended, considered the theory mechanically plausible enough to keep the suspicion alive for 3 decades rather than dismissing it outright. We arrive now at the fifth and final piece of this story, and unlike the previous 4, this one has nothing to do with an engine at all. The break-in that ended the season and the question for good. In 1995, with Alderman's Dodge program still performing at a championship level and suspicion about the team's methods still simmering across the Pro Stock garage, the Wayne County Speed Shop itself, the physical facility where the team's engines and cars were built and maintained, was broken into. Equipment was damaged. The team's competitive season, which had started strong with multiple wins and runner-up finishes, effectively fell apart in the aftermath. Warren Johnson, Alderman's chief championship rival, went on a historic point surge that carried him to the title that year. The break-in was never conclusively solved, and the explanations that circulated through the sport in the years afterward split cleanly along the same lines as the nitrous suspicion itself. Some in the sport believed it was simple, opportunistic vandalism or theft. unconnected to any larger conspiracy. Others noted the timing, coming during a period when suspicion about the team's engine program had reached its peak, and openly speculated that the incident conveniently destroyed evidence NHRA might otherwise have eventually found, or alternatively, that it was orchestrated specifically to prevent a sanctioning body from formally investigating a team that Chrysler's own marketing dollars had a significant financial interest in protecting from public scandal. Neither theory has ever been proven. NHRA never issued a public finding either confirming or denying nitrous use by the Wayne County program at any point across Alderman's career. No teardown ever produced disqualifying hardware. No former crew member ever went on record with a detailed, verifiable account of an illegal system in operation. What exists instead 3 decades later is a carburetor backfire heard by hundreds of witnesses at the biggest event of the season, a fuel and ignition program that pushed legal boundaries further than most of the field was willing to push them, a mechanical reality that a simple nitrous system could theoretically be installed and removed within a narrow inspection window, and a facility break-in that ended a championship season at precisely the moment suspicion was at its highest. Here's what I want you to sit with after this video ends. Every piece of this story, taken individually, has an entirely legitimate, non-nitrous explanation. Exceptional fuel chemistry developed through factory-level engineering support, aggressive ignition timing extracted through genuine tuning skill, a dramatic backfire that reflects the ragged edge of naturally aspirated performance rather than a power adder failure, a simple hardware footprint that could theoretically disappear within minutes, whether or not it ever actually existed, a break-in that could just as easily have been ordinary criminal opportunism as it could have been something more deliberate. None of these things alone proves anything. Together, sustained across an entire championship-winning career, they produced a level of sustained suspicion within professional drag racing's own garage that no technical inspection process was ever able to definitively resolve, one direction or the other. Darrell Alderman won 3 NHRA Pro Stock World Championships, 28 national event victories, and never once received a formal NHRA disqualification for a power adder violation across his entire career. Whether that record reflects the accomplishment of an exceptionally skilled team operating at the absolute outer edge of legal, naturally aspirated engineering, or a program that understood exactly how far a sanctioning body's inspection process could see and built its advantage specifically in the space just beyond it, is a question the sport itself has debated for 30 years without ever reaching a conclusion either side could fully accept. He did not need to be caught to leave the entire Pro Stock garage certain that something about that engine was different. And in racing, in life, the suspicion that lingers when nothing can ever quite be proven is sometimes more powerful and more permanent than a rule that was ever actually broken. Consider the shape of the career that followed. Alderman's federal legal troubles in late 1991, entirely separate from the nitrous suspicion and stemming from cocaine charges he pleaded guilty to, resulted in NHRA suspending him for the 1992 and 1993 seasons, a punishment the sanctioning body was able to hand down clearly and decisively because the violation itself was unambiguous, documented, and resolved through the ordinary machinery of the criminal justice system. There was no room for competing interpretations. He pleaded guilty. The suspension followed. The sport moved on to Scott Giuffrian taking over the Mopar seat, and when Alderman returned in 1994, he did so under a level of scrutiny that few returning champions in any sport have ever had to operate under. A garage full of rivals who had spent 2 full seasons rebuilding their own programs specifically to catch back up to a combination they had never fully understood in the first place. That context matters enormously to understanding why the nitrous suspicion took root so quickly and so deeply the moment Alderman returned to winning form in 1994. Competing teams had used the suspension years to study everything about Wayne County's cars that had been publicly available: engine specifications, chassis setups, gear ratios, every legal data point the sport's own record-keeping made accessible. And when Alderman came back and immediately resumed dominating the class at nearly the same level as before his suspension, several rival crew chiefs reportedly told reporters and fellow competitors, some on record and many not, that the performance gap simply did not add up using any combination of legal modifications they had been able to identify or replicate during those 2 years of study. That is the specific frustration that turned a general garage rumor into the kind of focused, public suspicion that erupted so visibly after the Indianapolis backfire. It is worth pausing on why NHRA's own institutional position throughout this entire saga remains so consistently neutral, neither exonerating Wayne County publicly nor pursuing a more aggressive, targeted investigation, the way some rival teams privately wished they would. Chrysler's sponsorship dollars and the broader Mopar marketing relationship built around Alderman's championship success represented a significant piece of the sports commercial ecosystem during this era, a sanctioning body publicly investigating and potentially disqualifying its most commercially valuable manufacturer partnership over an allegation it could never conclusively prove would have created exactly the kind of public relations crisis that professional sports organizations across every discipline have historically gone to significant lengths to avoid, absent hard, undeniable evidence. This is not a claim that NHRA deliberately looked away. It is an observation that the sport's own commercial incentives, combined with a genuinely inconclusive technical record, created powerful institutional reasons to let the question fade rather than escalate it into a formal, sport-wide controversy that could not be resolved definitively either way. Rival teams, for their part, responded the way competitive programs in any sport eventually respond when they cannot prove a specific allegation against a dominant rival. They stopped trying to catch Wayne County through protest and inspection requests and started trying to out-engineer the program instead, pouring resources into their own fuel chemistry, ignition mapping, and combustion chamber development in an arms race that, whether or not Nitrous was ever actually involved, measurably accelerated the pace of legitimate, naturally aspirated engineering advancement across the entire Pro Stock class through the mid-1990s. Warren Johnson, the driver most consistently positioned as Alderman's primary championship rival throughout this era, built an engineering program at Warren Johnson Racing, specifically engineered to match and eventually exceed the performance levels Wayne County had established. And by the back half of the decade, elapsed times across the entire field had dropped to a point that made the specific performance gap of the early 1990s look, in hindsight, considerably less exceptional than it had felt in the moment. That is, in its own way, the most honest resolution this story has ever received. Not a formal finding, not a confession, not a definitive teardown that settled the question one direction or the other. Simply an entire class of competitors who could not prove what they suspected, and who responded the only way a legitimate racing program can respond to an unprovable suspicion, by getting better themselves until the specific advantage in question, whatever its true source had been, stopped being decisive. One of the most discussed single moments in Pro Stock history, precisely because it sits in that uncomfortable middle ground between spectacle and evidence. Hundreds of people heard it. Nobody could definitively explain it in a way that satisfied everyone who heard it. And the team at the center of it went on to win a third championship, retire from active NHRA competition with its reputation formally intact under every rule the sport actually enforced, and leave behind a question that engine builders, historians, and fans continue to argue about at every Pro Stock reunion event and internet forum thread dedicated to the era. 3 decades after the sound itself faded from the air over Indianapolis Raceway Park. Darrell Alderman himself, in the rare interviews where the subject has come up over the years, has consistently and firmly denied any use of nitrous oxide or any other illegal power adder throughout his career, attributing his team's performance entirely to the engineering partnership between Wayne County Speed Shop, Mopar's factory support, and his own skill behind the wheel. There is no public record of anyone directly connected to the program ever contradicting that account on the record. Proof of innocence. But it is also not nothing, and any honest accounting of this story has to hold both possibilities in mind at once. The possibility that Wayne County Speed Shop was simply better at naturally aspirated engineering than anyone else in the sport during that specific window of time, and the possibility that they were better because they had access to a margin the rest of the field did not. That tension, unresolved and probably unresolvable at this point in history, is exactly why this story has endured as long as it has. A cheating scandal with a confession or a definitive teardown becomes a closed chapter, remembered but settled. A cheating scandal that never quite closes stays alive in a sport's collective memory in a way that clean resolutions never do, retold at every reunion, argued over in every online forum, revisited every time a new generation of fans discovers pro stock history and asks the same question the garage was asking in real time back in 1994. What was actually happening inside that engine, and why could nobody, not one single time across an entire championship career, ever prove it either way?